There are forces of good and forces of evil at work in the world today. What are these forces? Who is responsible for the good? And who is responsible for the evil? Richard Schaff talks about current events which are rarely discussed by the mainstream media, events that affect us all. This program seeks to identify, to inform, and to equip the believer for what's ahead. Welcome to What in the World is Going On?
I'm your host, Richard Schaff. The program is sponsored by Lincoln Log Homes. We are pro-Christian, pro-American, pro-life, pro-Second Amendment, here only by the grace of God. Today's program will not have any of our Lincoln Log commercials. We're going to look at one subject. It is a critical subject. I believe, from what I have seen, that the United States is in a state that they've only been in twice before. 1776, at the birth of our republic, and in the 1980s, prior to the start of the Civil War. I don't think that our commander-in-chief is fooling around. Did you see his speech, Valdosta, Georgia, Saturday, December 5th? That was last night. I watched it. Did he look like a beaten man to you? A beaten winner? To me, he looked like one determined commander-in-chief. I want to state, in case you hadn't guessed it, I am a Trump supporter. And I hope I have the strength and the will to stand with my president through all that I think is coming. I believe that we are facing a time when we're going to be called upon to follow the examples of our founders back in the 1700s. Our history tells us they gave their farms, they gave their fortunes, they gave their personal lives, that we would have the republic that we have today. I believe we're on the edge of losing that republic. And I think that our commander-in-chief, Donald Trump, is fully aware of it. I want to bring you some of the facts that I have to let you see why I believe what I believe. And to tell you right now, patriots, it is time that we lock and load. The information I'm going to share with you, I've been accumulating over several weeks. I could have brought it a week ago, but it's kind of extreme. And I wanted to make sure the facts. And I have the facts now. I have confirmation. I'm going to be quoting extensively from an article by Mike Adams that he gave on Thursday, December 3rd. Situation update. Trump invokes foreign interference provision of his 2018 executive order authorizing response to cyber warfare. This comes to me, as I said, from Mike Adams through Natural News. They suggest that you ask yourself the question, what was the purpose of Trump's Wednesday, December 2nd White House speech about election fraud and vote rigging? If you think it was all about Trump communicating to the people, think again. This speech was really about Trump communicating with Chris Miller in the Department of Defense about foreign interference in the U.S. election, while laying out the key national security justifications that are necessary to invoke the national security option for defending the U.S. against an attempted cyber warfare coup. That's right, a coup of the United States government. We're going to look at some of the details, and I've got to give you some basic information that's boring, I know. But to start with, I want to reference you to 10 U.S.C. Section 394, Subtitle A, Part 1, Chapter 19. That states the authorities concerning military cyber operations as well as a National Security Presidential Memorandum, that's NSPM, number 13, covering, quote, offensive cyber operations. Thursday's situation update, December 3rd. Look at the details of how Trump just invoked the legal framework, the national security provisions that are necessary to allow the Secretary of Defense, Chris Miller, to activate military processes that lead to a tactical takedown of domestic enemies and active traitors. Trump's Department of Defense intelligence team set the traps for the Democrats. They've set the traps for acts of treason and warfare against America. Decoding President Trump's December 2nd speech, consider what Trump said in that speech. You could watch the full speech, but if you didn't know what to look for, you'll miss all of the important language. That speech was about 95% filler. Only 5% of it really matters. That's what we're going to look at in this broadcast. First, he says that he has a sworn affidavit to defend the U.S. Constitution against the wartime siege that's underway. That from our president. As president, I have no higher duty than to defend the laws and the Constitution of the United States. That's why I am determined to protect our election system, which is now under coordinated assault and siege. A quote from our president. He then explains that the vote was criminally rigged with fraud. And folks, fraud is a crime. And that now it's time to overturn the election results and correct them. His thoughts and words. Millions of votes were cast illegally in the swing states alone. And if that's the case, the results of the individual swing states must be overturned, and overturned immediately. Then he explains that China was part of the entire plan from the very beginning. This by their engineering and launching of the coronavirus, which Democrats used to justify mass mail-in ballots, which were used to steal the election. This statement specifically invoked national security elements of our defense protocols. The Democrats had this election rigged right from the beginning. Our president's words. They used the pandemic as an excuse to mail out tens of millions of ballots, which led to a big part of the fraud. And there's no one happier than China. Trump then calls for a full domestic audit, which can obviously only take place under military authority, since the local election officials are corrupt, federal criminals. Oh yes, he explains this himself. Dramatically eroding the integrity of our elections was the Democrat #1 priority, for a simple reason: they wanted to steal the 2020 presidential election. All of the Democrat efforts to expand mail-in balloting laid the groundwork for the systematic and pervasive fraud that occurred in our last election. Then about 30 minutes into his speech, Trump invokes legal action that clearly references Trump's September 12, 2018 executive order, which describes remedies for foreign interference in U.S. election. Here's what Trump had to say. Quote, "The only conceivable reason why you would block common sense measures to verify legal eligibility for voting is if you're trying to encourage, enable, solicit, or carry out fraud. It's important for Americans to understand that this destructive change in our election laws were not a necessary response to the pandemic. The pandemic simply gave the Democrats an excuse to do what they were trying to do for many, many years." Note carefully the phrase, trying to encourage, enable, solicit, or carry out fraud. What have we heard? We've heard something similar to that before. Well, in the 2018 executive order, which describes who will be subjected to having all their assets seized by the United States government, and note that this applies to corporations, individuals, partnerships, and even nonprofits. Section 2A2, to have materially assisted, sponsored, or provided financial, material, or technological support for, or goods or services to be or in support of any activity described in subsection A1. It states to have directly or indirectly engaged in, sponsored, concealed, or otherwise being complicit in foreign interference is a United States election. Thus, Trump just invoked his 2018 executive order. He sent an undeniable signal to Chris Miller at the Department of Defense, as well as many other groups. He noted that the Democrats, the treasonous media, and the complicit big tech giants have all engaged in concealing, advocating, or supporting foreign interference in the U.S. election. What's the remedy for such actions of treason against the United States? Well, under existing law, it's a felony crime to try to rig votes. Under military law, during a time of war, it's treason. And under the 2018 executive order, each of the entities engaging in this behavior will all have their assets seized by the United States Treasury. Translated into plain language, this means that Twitter, Facebook, CNN, The Washington Post, Google, MSNBC, well, all of them, they're now able and to be completely seized, shut down, or taken over by the Trump administration. As folks, they all engaged in the defined behaviors outlined in the executive order of 2018, which Trump just cited. It's all there, folks. Consider this. We see all the evidence that Trump's attorneys and the Department of Defense White Hat team members now possess. Well, much of which is going to be presented to the Supreme Court, most likely by Sidney Powell, once one of the cases reaches that level of judicial system. But a few things I'll point out to you now. CIA Director Gina Haspel admitting to election interference in a full confession, which has now been acquired. Dominion, that's the voting machine, folks, their executives confessing to engineering backdoors into the system, which has also been acquired. Packet analysis results from white hats who intercepted all of the real-time vote rigging traffic, which includes the specific instructions from CIA servers to add the hundreds of thousands of votes in real time, this to Dominion tabulation machines in swing states. This is now publicly confirmed by Colonel Phil Waldron. Also log files and software evidence from the seized CIA servers in Frankfurt, Germany, which provides physical and intellectual proof that the CIA inserted hundreds of thousands of votes into the Dominion tabulation machines. All of this evidence exists right now. President Donald Trump has it all. His speech lays the official groundwork that can now be cited by other officials, namely in the Department of Defense, the Treasury, and the Treasury does run the Secret Service, you know. This all in order to justify their own initiative of orders for further arrest, rendition flights, and wartime activities necessary to defend the United States of America against foreign enemies who are waging cyber warfare against the United States. In case you're wondering whether the U.S. military under Trump has the authorization to respond to acts of cyber warfare with coordinated conventional military actions, read section USC, section 394, subtitle A, part 1, chapter 19. Bottom line, folks, before you look it up, let me tell you, the military does have the right to move in. From authorities concerning military cyber operations, in general, the Secretary of Defense shall prepare and coordinate, make ready all armed forces for purposes of, and when appropriately authorized to do so, conduct military cyber activities or operations in cyberspace, including clandestine military activities or operations in cyberspace. This all to defend the United States and its allies, including in response to malicious cyber activity carried out against the United States or a United States person by a foreign power. And do you think our president who drafted this isn't prepared to pull the plug? Affirmation of authority. Congress affirms that the activities or operations referred to in subsection A, when appropriately authorized, include take the conduct of military activities or operations in cyberspace, short of hostilities. This, such as the term used in the War Powers Act. Clandestine operations. A clandestine military operation or activity in cyberspace shall be considered a transitional military activity. This found in 503E2 of the National Security Act of 1947. The term clandestine military activity or operation in cyberspace means a military activity or military operation carried out in cyberspace or associated preparatory actions authorized by the President of the United States or the Department of Defense. Part was marked, held in, or conducted in secrecy. This is where the intent is that the activity or operation will not be apparent or acknowledged publicly. And B, it is to be carried out. As part of a military operation approved by the President or the Secretary in anticipation of hostilities, or as directed by the President or the Secretary. To defer, safeguard, or defend against attack or malicious cyber activities against the United States or Department of Defense information, network, systems, installation, facilities, or other assets. Trump announced offensive cyber operations just 1 week after signing his September 12, 2018 executive order. As you think about all of the implications of this, note carefully that just 8 days after President Trump signed his September 12, 2000 executive order, the Trump administration announced the launch of offensive cyber operations against foreign enemies. That was reported by the Washington Post, which explained the strategic incorporates a new classified presidential directive that replaced one from the Obama administration. It allows the military and other agencies to undertake cyber operations intended to protect their systems and the national critical networks. Just 8 days earlier, President Trump has designated election infrastructure as a critical infrastructure. So now the pieces fit. The circle is complete. The election theft was cyber warfare against critical U.S. infrastructure. This authorized all kinds of national security activities, such as using U.S. Army Special Forces units to raid the CIA server farm in Frankfurt, Germany. That took place shortly after the election, as previously reported. Also in 2018, President Trump had authorized the National Security Presidential Memorandum, known as NSPM, number 13, covering offensive cyber operations. Here's a list of some of the NSPMs, but notable offensive cyber operations is a secret, and it's not publicly shown. In fact, the Trump administration fought to keep his document hidden from Congress. Given that back in 2018, the House, which was then and still is run by Pelosi and other treasonous actors, they had just pulled off the 2000 cyber attack on the U.S. election infrastructure, stealing dozens of House seats in order to win the majority of the House. That was back in 2018. That's when they gave Adam Schiff his seat so he could launch his impeachment scheme. You know, the one to try to remove Trump from power. It's been going on a little bit, folks. Well, Trump was able to prevent the House from reading NSPM 13 for 17 months. This according to a report from Fifth Dominion. On a bipartisan basis, some of us sent a letter to the Trump administration. This is Mike Adams speaking now. Sent a letter to the Trump administration demanding that they share with at least some of the leadership of the Armed Services Committee the rules of engagement for certain cyber contingencies. What is now known is that Trump was planning the 2020 election sting, the cyber warfare trap, in 2018. He was 2 years ahead of time. And that these cyber warfare response protocols were intentionally kept from Congress for as long as possible while plans were made to put in place to catch the Democrats stealing the next election. That's right, the one in 2020, the one we just had. Rest assured, what we now know with absolute certainty is that Trump, Miller, Kornwertneck, and other key players put the cyber warfare infrastructure in place in 2018, the one that would allow them to unleash a domestic military response to arrest, detain, and prosecute all those who were complicit in the attack on America. The Patriot, in other words, are really in charge. And they planned all of this since 2018, putting in place the framework to trigger the appropriate national security resources once the Democrats took the bait and tried to steal the 2020 election. You know, Gitmo must be getting full, close to capacity at this point. A lot of detainees on their way there. The mass arrests are coming. President Trump is in charge. And the Dems who know what's really happening are beyond terrified. They know they've been caught. Some will be charged with treason. Many will face military tribunals. A few will likely be executed after found guilty of treason. My words when I began, my words now. Finally, lock and load, patriots, because Trump may still need 1 million armed patriots to show up in D.C. as the critical moments of all of this are publicly announced. Stand by for further instructions from our Commander-in-Chief. And goodbye, and pray for our country. We're seeing a situation that we haven't seen since the Civil War, and be that back to the founding of our republic in 1776. We live in critical times. We have a humongous obligation. Be strong and be ready and be in prayer.